So driven were they in their desire for success and wealth that George and Began were oblivious to the catastrophic impact their actions were having on their children. Years later, Ethel's brother, Rushton Skakel, by then a recovering alcoholic, remembered that fateful time. Dad's alcoholism hit him when we were in Larchmont, because of all those parties, and all the drinking that went on. I never considered my mom an alcoholic. She drank with Dad, but I never saw her snockered. And that's when we started drinking. As little tots. My sisters and brothers and I would take the glasses with a little liquor or wine left in them into the kitchen, and we'd drink them. My sister George Ann, who was 15 when we got to Larchmont, was an alcoholic. And alcohol ran through our family, and that's how we grew up. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise. We're going to continue in part 3 of The Other Mrs. Kennedy. And of course, as I've always remind you, that is Ethel Kennedy that we're discussing. And it's worth reminding you because up until this point, we really have barely talked about Ethel at all. She was born in the last chapter, but we're still talking about the family. We're still talking about the culture of the family. And a lot of emphasis is being placed on what kind of parental experience she had. And what kind of household was it? Was it calm? Was it orderly? No. And in this section, we're going to talk about the family having more money than they know what to do with. But they are so completely dysfunctional. And we're going to touch on some things that shocked me. The parents are so out of the loop that by the age of 16, their oldest daughter was a confirmed alcoholic. And she's in charge of all these kids. Because remember, Mama's got to go and do Mama's things. Mama's busy. Mama's busy socializing. Mama's busy shopping, and going to Mass every time the church doors are open. But she doesn't have time to take care of all these kids. That's not fun. And so George Ann is the one who's really up to her neck in responsibilities. And so she's hit the bottle. And that is a major theme in the later part of this part 3 that we're going to cover today. I thought that it was super interesting, and I hope you enjoy it with me. If you recall, the book is divided into parts, and within those parts are the chapters. So we're on chapter 11. We're on part 3. Part 3 is entitled Bowl of Cherries. So we're going to talk about how it's the Depression era, but this family, the Skakel family, is doing just fine. And they had some troubles initially at the very beginning of the Depression because everybody did. But once they got back on their feet, they never missed a beat. And everybody else around them is starving, and they're just living like kings. Okay. Chapter 11, Depression Years. By 1932, the Great Depression was at its peak. Chicago's factories and rail yards resembled ghost towns. The streets were unswept, the parks overgrown. More than 50,000 unemployed men and women roamed the streets. The city was shrouded in hopelessness and despair, wrote journalist and historian Cable Phillips. It was in Chicago that stifling June of 1932 that both national political parties met in convention. The Republicans renominated President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for the current mess. The Democrats chose New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who pledged to bring back prosperity. Songwriters sat at their keyboards in Tin Pan Alley documenting America's mood and lyrics. The song most descriptive of the unrelenting agony was Bing Crosby's Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? For the Skakels, though, a popular tune by Rudy Vallée and his Connecticut Yankees seemed more apropos. It was called Life is Just a Bowl of Cherries. After a brief hiatus, Great Lakes Coal & Coke was rolling in money once again while all around the economy worsened. The aluminum industry was one of the few that had made a quick recovery, producing the metal that was used to manufacture airplanes, and George's company had a virtual monopoly on supplying the necessary ingredient. Aluminum production soared throughout the Depression because the airline business was growing quickly. In its maiden flight over the Rocky Mountains, the aluminum alloy DC-1 had performed well, another step forward in convincing the public of the safety and practicality of commercial aviation. Highly publicized record-breaking flights by aviators like Wiley Post and Amelia Earhart added to the excitement. The number of known millionaires in America had dropped substantially to only about 24. George Skakel, who kept a low profile and whose company was privately held, had become one of them. In judging other men, noted Jim Skakel years later, my father's standard was when those men made their fortune, not how big it was. He was always proud he made his money in the Depression, the worst of the Depression. One of the keys to George's enormous success was his obsession with secrecy and privacy. Over the years, as the company grew, business publications ranging from the Wall Street Journal to Fortune tried unsuccessfully to interview and profile him. Eventually, Great Lakes would become one of the largest, if not the largest, privately owned companies in America. Yet the number of words written about it would fill less than a column of newsprint. "We always tried to keep a low profile," noted Patrick Graham. "We never sought PR because we were one of the largest private companies and had a monopolistic position in certain areas, and we just didn't want to attract attention to ourselves. We just stayed quiet and made money." Years later, after Ethel married Bobby Kennedy, a longtime family friend noted wryly that one of the major differences between George Skakel and Ethel's father-in-law Joe Kennedy was that Old Man Skakel paid to keep his name out of the paper, and Old Man Kennedy paid to put his name in the paper. Because business was so good, Ethel, just 4, was seeing even less of her parents. George and Anne spent much of their time in New York City, commuting back and forth virtually on a weekly basis aboard the 20th Century Limited. George's days were filled with rounds of meetings with bankers, suppliers, and customers, while Anne shopped and prayed on Fifth Avenue, at Saks Bergdorf's, and St. Patrick's Cathedral, respectively. Manhattan had become George's second home because that was where the company's new lead banks, Chemical and New York Trust, were located. The city was also headquarters for some of the major oil refiners the Great Lakes did business with. Even more important, George had expanded operations over the past 2 years into the international market. Great Lakes Coal and Coke now had 1- or 2-man sales offices in most foreign and Asian countries, including Germany and Japan. Since most had representatives in New York, George's presence was required there on a regular basis. Eventually, 65% of the company's income would be derived from foreign sales. Of all the world's powers, George saw the Soviet Union as the biggest threat to the Great Lakes Coal and Coke survival. Hungry for hard currency in the worldwide depression, the Russians had started sending tankers to the United States, selling oil for as little as 50 cents a barrel, when the going rate was 3 times that. George's greatest fear was that the Russians, with their huge oil fields, might be tempted to dump carbon and coke on the world market, thus wreaking havoc with his company's price structure. Worse, if the aluminum company started dealing with the cut-rate Russians, George would be left sitting on tons of unsaleable coke and carbon, which would wipe him out overnight. With that threat hanging over him, he began making surreptitious trips to spy on his Russian competition. George's other enemy was Franklin D. Roosevelt. His apprehension about the new president centered on the thicket of regulations that Roosevelt intended to impose on big business. The concept of big government and the New Deal sickened the boss of Great Lakes Coal and Coke. George hated Roosevelt, said J. Mayhew, the company's chief geologist and George's longtime confidant. He felt that Roosevelt would run the country into the ground. He felt Roosevelt would become a dictator. I mean, he did take 3 terms when you're not even supposed to, so he might not have been wrong. George would be shocked years later when his daughter Ethel joined America's bastion of liberalism, the Kennedy clan, emulators of many of Roosevelt's social and political philosophies. Okay, so they've set the scene, right? George's business is in New York. Okay, so the family's got to get on over there. And it's a huge disruption, honestly, because the family has been in Chicago all of the lives of their children. George and Anne are from Chicago. All their friends and family are from Chicago. The culture that they know, the Catholic culture that they're a part of, it's in Chicago. And so to uproot everybody and bring the crazy clan over to New York, it's unsettling to the family, but it continues to be unsettling in a different kind of way. It's like they're about to embark on a great adventure and their surroundings are greatly and vastly improved, but in the vastness of what they are about to embark on, in the great grandeur of what they are about to have, it's like the family starts losing itself in how much money and how much they have. So let's keep reading and you'll see what I mean. Because so much business was now being conducted in New York, George decided to move east permanently to establish executive offices in Manhattan, while Walter Graham remained in Chicago, running the research, development, engineering, and service divisions. In the months prior to the move, scheduled for late spring of 1933, Big Ann was filled with a mixture of ebullience and melancholy. The decision to relocate, which George had made quickly and unilaterally, had left his wife unnerved. Big Ann loved Chicago, where her friends and family lived. This venture east, under uncharted territory, for which she was unprepared socially and intellectually, made her feel anxious and vulnerable. A bigger shock came in May 1932. At the age of 40, as she was looking forward to a more leisurely life as the wife of a rising baron of industry, Big Ann discovered that she was due to have her 7th child, around the time of the stressful move. Despite a full-time nurse, household help, sitters, and her mother, She felt her hands were full with the 6 children she already had, ranging in age from Ethel, an antsy 5, to George Ann, an adolescent 15. But a greater emotional blow was in store for Big Ann, one that would leave her devastated for months to come. In quick succession, her sister Ethel and one of her best friends, Frances McGuire, died suddenly. Coming home late one night from a party, Ethel Brannick Solari suffered a massive heart attack. Only 35, she left 3 young children, Joel, Bobby, and Celeste, and a husband who would never be the same. Her death was a shocker for another reason. It revealed a genetic heart problem that would severely impact the next generation of Skakel males. Okay, so in light of the loss that she suffered, perhaps her inability to parent can continually be seen through the lens of her grief, because she wasn't really a very hands-on mom, honestly, from the beginning. But now you compound it with the fact that she has lost her best friend and her sister, who she was exceedingly close to. It would leave anybody looking for an escape route from reality. And Anne had many, 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 many distractions. And those distractions did not ever include her children. Instead of turning inward towards her family, towards the things that could make her feel safer, she turns away from the family, and rightly so, because the kids, as we're going to read, are wild. It would not be relaxing to hang around these kids. It would not be comforting to hang around these kids. You know, it's like you create the home you want. And Anne has been so busy shopping and socializing that she has not created a place that is safe to come home to. So she's going to keep avoiding that. And for a person, like I said earlier, who had already started out, motherhood and married life as avoiding the home, do you think now that she's really sad, she's going to turn into the most chaotic place ever? A home with 6 kids that are all out of control, now adding a 7th? No, Anne is more checked out than ever. Now, it says that on February 14th, 1933, Big Ann gave birth without complication to her 7th child, her 4th daughter, a healthy pink-cheeked blonde with blue eyes whom she named after herself. Little Anne looked like her mother more than any of the others that come for. She was the only blonde child. I think it's wild to name your kid after yourself. Like, I even get the idea of naming your first son after your father. I understand that tradition, but I could never name one of my daughters. I only have one, but I could never have named her Cheer. I like my name. It's not that I don't like my name. It's just that it would be weird to call somebody after yourself. People can do it all they want, but like, this is the 2nd child that Anne has named after herself. Does anybody else find that odd? Because Georgie Ann, remember, they thought that was the only kid they were going to have because they had her right during World War I. And so they thought, oh, this might be the only child we have. We'll combine our names and she'll be George Ann. Okay, so Anne's already gotten her foot in the door on the whole naming your kids after yourself. But now she's got to name another child after herself? What's going on with Anne? A little bit of a narcissist. In June 1933, following a family visit to Chicago's spectacular Century of Progress exposition, the Skakels piled into 2 chauffeur-driven Lincoln touring cars and headed for their new life on the East Coast. The trip, which took more than a week over 2-lane roads, included overnight stays at the Depression-ravaged homes of farmers who charged travelers minimally for room and board as a way of bringing in some money. Because the trip would be too strenuous for the baby, Big Ann left her in the care of a nurse in Chicago. After the family reached their first destination, a small family-style hotel in New Rochelle, New York, she returned for the 4-month-old. The family briefly stayed at the hotel, then rented an oceanfront mansion surrounded by a high wall of hedges in Monmouth Beach, New Jersey, an area populated by a number of Prohibition gangsters. Because of the Depression, the rent was minimal, and there were few, if any, vacationers. Early each morning, George's chauffeur drove him up the Jersey coast to a point where he boarded a ferry to Manhattan, then took a cab to the company's offices in the recently built Empire State Building. First of all, can you imagine living in a hotel with 6 children? Baby not quite there yet. Baby's been left in Chicago, but you got 6 kids. And these kids are not like some sweet children. And if you guys remember when I was living in a hotel when we first moved up to DC and could not find our house, I have 3 really well-behaved children, and I wanted to pull my hair out. It was by far the most stressful experience of all time. She's got 6 kids who are wild in a small family-style hotel. Can you imagine how excited the proprietors of that hotel were to see that family leave? All right, so here they are. They're living on the beach. George is, leaving at the crack of dawn to get all the way to Manhattan in the Empire State Building. And Big Ann, what's she doing? Big Ann lolled on the beach, watching little Ethel chase her brothers. The child was generally boisterous and bouncy, tossing a beach ball and getting the boys to teach her how to throw a football. Within days of hitting the beach, she got a full tan. She liked to run around without any clothes on. She was cute. I mean, she's 5. It's kind of like a little old for like no clothes on. I mean, can Ethel not bestir herself to get up and put something on the baby? She was cute and talkative and agreeable, a sweet little girl who played with the boys all the time, said Florence Comfer. But there was nothing exceptional about her. She toddled along with the rest of them. In the fall, the Skakels moved again, this time to a mansion in Larchmont, New York, a small, affluent town with a good-sized Catholic population, which appealed to Began. Set on more than a dozen manicured acres, the furnished house was so enormous that the children never saw all the rooms. And their mother only used a portion of them. It was a fabulous place, recalled Rushton Skakel. So big none of us could believe it, and mind-bogglingly beautiful. Again, because of the Depression, the Skakels got the house for virtually nothing, renting it from another high-rolling Catholic family who was living in Europe. The estate was a perfect setting for George to entertain his clients, which he and Big Ann did in grand style several times a week. For Big Ann, the house was flawless for another reason. It was situated directly across the road from a Catholic church and school that specialized in teaching difficult children, of which she had her share. The Dominican day school, where Big Ann enrolled 5.5-year-old Ethel in kindergarten and her older brothers and sisters in higher grades that September 1933, was a private academy founded and ruled over by Sister Rose Alma, a stern nun in her mid-30s who had, quote, something of a masculine nature and mentality, direct and hard, a relative said. Rose Alma had seen that the well-heeled Catholic parents of Larchmont and neighboring Rye desperately needed a private progressive school that could give their spoiled, ill-mannered, and often troubled children special attention in the basics and social graces. By the time the Skakels had moved in, their children perfect candidates for Rose Alma's educational philosophy, the school was going strong in an old 3-story red brick house just across the street. It seems like it would be ideal. You got this huge house to bang around in. There's so many rooms. You haven't even seen the whole house. It's so big. And you got the school right across the way. A school that specializes in troubled children, of which, as the book says, Big Ann had many. And what would not be to like? Well, it's because it is non-stop partying at this house. Legitimately. And there's nothing that Sister Rose Alma can do about that. The book goes on to describe it in this chapter entitled Larchmont Living, and I found this chapter to be quite intriguing. It says, unfortunately, Rose Alma's liberal teaching environment could not rehabilitate Big Ann's increasingly uncontrollable brood. The children's life at home had become the antithesis of everything the nun was trying to accomplish in the classroom. The Skakel home had become the setting for one round of parties after another, beginning in the early morning when George held breakfast meetings with his business colleagues, and ending long past midnight, following cocktails, dinner, and more drinks, with other associates. George, with Big Ann's full and complete support, was attempting to establish an immediate and resounding presence for himself and Great Lakes Coal & Coke in New York, and the impressive Larchmont house, staffed with servants, stocked with the best liquor and the finest foods, was his lure, delighting and overwhelming all those who were invited. He used the house as he did the hunting trips and the golf links to generate business. The house and his home life became an extension of his business. Even the children were part of the tableau he presented to his cronies and customers. Having little Ethel, George Jr., Jimmy, Rushton, George Ann, and Pat present during the parties, rather than hidden away upstairs, suggested to George's guests that he was just a regular family man at heart, that the Skakels were a happy family. Anne even brought down the baby so the businessmen could fawn over her. Seeing the family together like that gave George's clients a wholesome feeling about him, the kind they got looking at Norman Rockwell's family on the cover of Saturday Evening Post. Realizing the public relations benefit of the family, George even trotted out the children at business meetings in a kind of dog and pony show. So driven were they in their desire for success and wealth that George and Big Ann were oblivious to the catastrophic impact their actions were having on their children. Years later, Ethel's brother, Rushton Skakel, by then a recovering alcoholic, remembered that fateful time. I was 10 years old when we moved to the house in Larchmont. That house, all of our houses in fact, were usually mainly for business, the way for Dad to get together with his customers. Dad was establishing his company in New York, so my parents had parties. I mean, there were parties literally every day. There were business parties and social parties, and that's when Dad started drinking. Dad's alcoholism hit him when we were in Larchmont, because of all those parties, and all the drinking that went on. I never considered my mom an alcoholic. She drank with Dad, but I never saw her snockered. And that's when we started drinking. As little tots, my sisters and brothers and I would take the glasses with a little liquor or wine left in them into the kitchen, and we'd drink them. My sister Georgianne, who was 15 when we got to Larchmont, was an alcoholic. Alcohol ran through our family, and that's how we grew up. When there wasn't a party, Dad would go to bed at 8 o'clock in the evening because at 5:30 in the morning he was up to meet customers for breakfast. So we never saw much of him except on weekends when we'd take long walks in the woods. My father practically never went to a business meeting without one of us. We'd go into major board meetings at the big companies, and we'd be sitting there with all these industrialists and moguls. And you'd be the only child in the meeting, and it made a difference with those people. It impressed them and made the meeting a personal, beautiful thing in their eyes. And then our parents traveled a lot, so we had to go from that little nun school to the boarding school because there was nobody home. Can we just debrief on what we just read? Non-stop parties from dawn to late into the night. People at your house every minute of the day, and drinking occurring at all of it. And if all the adults are drinking, of course the kids are going to get in on it, and nobody's watching them because they are part of the tableau. They're just part of the scenery. You know, if they're going into the kitchen with the half-drunk glasses and drinking all that's left of them, well, who knows? Because the parents aren't watching. You know, whatever, kids will be kids. You know, you don't know where the kids are. They're just running around. So all the kids are drinking. The parents are drinking. The kids are drinking. Georgianne at 15 is an alcoholic, a confirmed alcoholic. Not like sometimes Georgianne would drink out of the parents' glasses, you know. But she's over there needing the alcohol at this point. According to a Skakel family friend, Mary Begley, Georgianne Skakel wasn't the only one of the children who suffered severe drinking problems. Jimmy Skakel's reputation was perfectly horrible, Begley said. You would hear about these crazy Skakels. Their names would come up in conversation. You hear people say, "Oh, can you imagine the Skakels? They have a son who's an alcoholic at age 16. When George and Big Ann traveled, more and more of the responsibility was put on the shoulders of Georgianne, the little mother, as one observer put it. While she was quite competent and mature for her age, she did have a major flaw: her drinking. As the Skakels' trips grew longer and the children got older and more undisciplined, Big Ann decided to send the boys away to school and get them out of her hair. For the time being, she permitted the little girls, Ethel, Pat, and Anne, to remain at home. The Skakels stayed in Larchmont for 2 years before renting another impressive house, a large white frame colonial a few miles north, in Rye. By that time the boys, Jim 14, George Jr. 13, and Rushton 12, were having serious difficulties with their studies and were considered disciplinary problems at their new school, Canterbury, a monastic Catholic boarding school located on a barren wooded hill near New Milford, Connecticut. Canterbury was a grim institution run by a stern Roman Catholic, Dr. Nelson Hum. Most of the students, sons of affluent Catholic families, were homesick and lonely, their long days filled with English, math, and the sciences, along with regular, tedious religious lectures. The Skakel boys, who'd never faced any form of discipline, were like fish out of water. Because of the strict rules, punishments, and rigid academic standards, the dropout rate at Canterbury was high. Only a few years before the Skakel boys were admitted, one of the students who quit because of mediocre grades, ill health, and homesickness was a 13-year-old from another big Catholic family, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who eventually transferred but would always remember and despise his time at Canterbury. It was a strict school in the English tradition, with high tea, noon tea, blazers, recalled Jim Skakel. The highest grade you could get was about 65, which was passing. They'd get you for signing your name or the date improperly, or if you didn't do something fast enough. There was that kind of discipline. It was tough. Jim Skakel was expelled from Canterbury after 1 year following an angry confrontation with a staff member. I caught the headmistress of the school I was living in going through my bureau drawers, my clothes and stuff, he said. She's just one of those nosy broads. But that was my personal property. Nobody goes in that. And I told her off, and that ended that. When Dr. Hum summoned Big Ann in the spring of 1935 to come get Jim and find another more suitable school for his brothers, she was naturally upset. But her irritation was not entirely related to her son's academic and behavioral problems. She and George had a busy schedule of travel ahead. A 3-month trip to Europe was on the agenda for that summer, and Big Ann didn't want to stay behind and deal with her boy's difficulties. A week before the Easter vacation, she sent an SOS to Sister Rose Alma at the Dominican Day School, where Ethel, 7, Pat, 9, were still students, seeking any help the nun could offer. Poor Sister Rose Alma. Why is it her problem to figure out what to do with the Skakel boys? You know, just because they went to her school, she's not got to be forever attached to them. They left because they're problem children and they needed some kind of guidance. And of course, Canterbury doesn't seem like it was the place for them, but why is Sister Rose Alma having to scramble to figure something out? Anne, you might just can't go to Europe this time. You might just can't. And it isn't somebody else's job to figure out, who's going to watch your kids or what to do with them. Okay, well, chapter 14, which is the last of this section, is entitled The Tutor. The answer to all of Big Anne's problems arrived in the person of Rose Alma's nephew, Martin Boswell McNelly, a tall, handsome 21-year-old pre-law major at Holy Cross, whose chiseled features, patrician manner, and precise way of speaking made him look and sound more like a Shakespearean actor than the son of a Newborough, New York plumbing contractor. It was a propitious meeting, in Rose Alma's study a few days later. Big Anne and McNelly hit it off immediately. She was impressed with the young man's academic credentials and demeanor, and he liked her style too. She was, he would say later, a woman of the greatest largesse, a woman of enormous personality, charm, and vigor. She had great style and the money to back it up. McNelly was to become a close friend, family advisor, and confidant, a featured player in many dramas of the Skakel family over the ensuing years. Eventually, he'd fall from grace. I can't wait. The moment Big Anne met McNally for the first time, she saw success written all over him, and her perception about him was on the mark. After graduating from Holy Cross, McNally got his law degree. During the war, he would serve as an officer and become active in the American Legion, rising to the powerful post of national commander. A super patriot at the height of the communist witch hunts of the 50s, he would denounce the United Nations, federal aid to education, and cultural exchanges with the Soviet Union. His financial backers would consist of close Skakel and Kennedy family friends, among them Senator Joe McCarthy and his cohort Roy Cohn, both of whom McNally idolized. He would eventually enter politics, winning election to the U.S. Congress. But his political career would end in shambles after only one term when a federal grand jury indicted him on charges of failing to file income tax returns for 4 years on almost $80,000. He would eventually plead guilty to one count, receive a $5,000 fine, and be placed on probation. Martin McNally would remain a bachelor, and although he was most often described in the New York Times profile as, quote, flamboyant, his true sexual preference would never be revealed. Through the years, while he'd taken care of the Skakel boys and courted and sought the hand in marriage of one of the Skakel girls, with the family's full and complete support, he kept his homosexuality in the closet. It was this revelation, in part, which eventually caused a breach with the Skakels. He suddenly started coming to the Great Lakes stockholders' meetings with his live-in, Rushton Skakel said later. And the live-in, who was older, was the male member, and Martin was the female. Oh, wow, what a shocker. In the spring of 1935, though, Big Anne saw young McNally as her saving grace, an erudite, mature young man in whose hands she felt she would safely place the enormous responsibility of tutoring her sons and daughters, acting as their companion. Years later, Ethel would place her own troubled sons in the hands of a man of similar demeanor. His name was Lem Billings, and I can't wait till we get to it. Years later, 2 days after his first meeting with Big Anne, McNally arrived at the Skakel house to spend the Easter break helping the failing Skakel boys with their studies. From the beginning, I was highly attracted to the boys, who were extraordinarily handsome and could have been in pictures, McNally said later. They allowed wit, humor, and laughs. I went upstairs with them to the 3rd floor, which they occupied, and by the end of that week, we'd become great friends. Is this how success is going to happen? By the tutor who's over there fawning all over his very handsome young students? And just hanging out with them for a week upstairs on the 3rd floor? No parents in sight? Yeah, I'm sure this was really wholesome. As for the girls, Ethel, who was a mere child at the time, was hyperkinetic about Jimmy, loved the wildness of the boys, followed them around like a puppy dog. She was always flighty, seemed lost, was never very bright, so she had to find her own identity, which was through riding horses and athletics. But she was a most charming girl, who gave her father, when he was home, which was rarely, many moments of amusement and entertainment and pleasure because she clowned for him to get his attention, and she was funny, relating things to him in her special way. Big Anne, McNally said, was so devoted to her husband that she was willing to allow the kids to fend for themselves. Ethel and the others were getting used to their parents going off and letting others care for them, he recalled. Big Anne felt she had to always be with her husband, just as later Ethel felt she always had to be with Bobby, leaving her kids in the care of others. Mrs. Skakel would tell Georgianne, "Now I have to go away, so make certain that the household runs, dear." Of course, there was a good deal of household help, a cook, waiters, waitresses, and chambermaids. George soon asked McNally to be the children's paid companion for the summer, while he and Big Anne were in Europe. George also indicated that if the arrangement worked out, there'd be a job in the company. He liked the cut of my jibe, McNally asserted. He seemed desperately anxious to have someone in the company with whom he could be close, a confidant. He needed someone whose loyalty would be intense and unquestionable. Big Anne's immediate concern before leaving for Europe was to get the boys into another school. On Rosa Alma's suggestion, she contacted Portsmouth Priory, which in many ways was like Canterbury. Established in the early 1920s, it was located in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. The goal of the school, which was operated by monastic Benedictine monks, was to ground the students thoroughly in Catholicism and give them a liberal academic education with a Catholic point of view. Big Anne took the boys for a visit, and while George Jr. liked the place and decided to stay, Rushton and Jim hated it. Jim felt that the Gothic environment was as stultifying as Canterbury and told his mother that he wouldn't go there. Rushton followed suit, but his reason for refusing admittance was quite different. The monk who took him on tour had only one eye, and the image frightened and upset the 12-year-old. Big Anne was able to convince Nelson Hum to readmit Rushton to Canterbury. Finding a school for Jim, on the other hand, was a bit more difficult. She finally enrolled him at an offbeat progressive non-Catholic boarding school, Raymond Riordan, in Highland, New York, where students learned to fly planes as an intellectual pursuit, chopped wood to supply heat for the place, and played in football games that never quite went the distance if the players got bored. Offering lots of freedom, it was Jim Skakel's kind of school. During his senior year at Priory, George Jr. crossed paths with another rich Catholic boy who was having problems in school. Small and skinny, Robert Francis Kennedy was as mediocre a student as George was. During one visit home, George told his brothers about meeting the son of the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. "He's a real little dick," was the way he described him. Bobby, who entered Priory in the winter of 1939, remained there throughout the end of the 1941 to 1942 school year. Like the Skakel boys, he jumped from one boarding school to another, 6 in 10 years. His younger brother Teddy also spent time at Priory, which at times seemed like a halfway house where wealthy and busy Catholic parents could just deposit their wayward sons. It was still some years down the road before the two families, the Skakels and the Kennedys, would come together. With the boys now enrolled in schools in 3 different states for the fall of 1935, and with a suitable male companion in place to guard over the brood at the house in Rye for the summer, George and Big Anne felt a sense of well-being as they prepared for their trip. Big Anne left a detailed note from Martin McNally about how to handle each of the children. Because little Ethel had had a foot-stamping fit when she found out her parents were going away again, Big Anne instructed McNally to, quote, "keep Ethel real busy. If she's active, she'll just forget we're gone." Spoken by a person who's never mothered her children. The next day, the Skakels steamed out in New York Harbor aboard the Normandy en route to Europe for 3 months of business and pleasure. The shipboard companions were George's partner, Walter Graham, and his wife. Great Lakes Coal and Coke was raking in more money than ever, and George was in the celebratory mood, which was underscored by an incident that happened one stormy night in the mid-Atlantic. After an evening of toasting their good fortune with champagne, the Skakels and the Grahams ventured out on deck for some air. The sky was black, the waves high, the wind strong, but all George felt was the bubbly he consumed. Suddenly, as Big Anne and the Grahams looked on in horror, George slowly climbed onto the ship's railing. As he stood up on unsteady legs, the stormy sea far below, Big Anne dropped to her knees and prayed aloud while the Grahams begged George to come to his senses. But George ignored their pleas, walking the rail with his arms outstretched to keep his balance. Finally, George hopped back on deck with an evil grin. Big Anne, furious at the risk he'd taken, dragged him back to their cabin, screaming at him all the way. George Skakel was a very dynamic guy, and he had great flair and great self-confidence, observed Patrick Graham years later. But he would be a flamboyant guy, free spirit who drank deeply of life. And those who came later, his sons, emulated his style somewhat. When he took it upon himself to walk the railing of that ship to the great dismay of his wife and my mother and father, he was showing his bravado, the daredevil in him. Back at home, Martin McNally and the Skakel children were having a grand time, too. He tutored the boys in Latin, math, and English several hours each day. But the rest of the time, the Skakel brothers and sisters had fun with their companion. It was a great summer, recalled McNally. We had all the country clubs we could possibly want. We had swimming pools, we had badminton, we had outings. We had everything. Did you? Well, you don't have parents. You know, I mean, it's like, can you even imagine? Like, what does this young guy, this 21-year-old guy, want to, like, go be nursemaid to this household of kids? What would, like, I don't understand what the motivation for him was. I mean, unless they were just paying him oodles of money, and he really didn't have anything greater that he wanted in life than to just play nursemaid. But I just can't even imagine why some 21-year-old guy would just want to take care of all these kids. Like, I just don't, and then to be like, it was a great time, we had a great time. I don't know. I just don't know that many guys that would think that that was great fun. But apparently he did, so good for him. But I just wonder what's going to happen with this guy, because it's not the same as having parents. Like having this, he just seems like he may have been just as irresponsible as the next one. Do you know what I'm saying? I just can't imagine that this person would have been real big on discipline if discipline was necessitated. And of course, Big Ann doesn't seem like she cares about discipline. She tells, if they seem upset, just, give them a good time, keep them busy. So there's no discipline happening in this house. It's give in, give in, give in. What is this child's language? What do they need to shut up? Okay, give it to them. Just so long as everyone's happy. We just want everyone to be happy. Well, they'd be happy if you'd stick around, Anne. What a paltry little way to calm your maternal guilt. Oh, just keep her busy. She'll forget we're even gone. She'll just forget. No, Ethel's not going to forget that her mom's not around for the umpteenth time. I'm enjoying this book. I just think this is juicy. Just to read about the way these people lived is crazy. And we haven't even gotten into Ethel yet. But the setup is fabulous. I hope you guys are enjoying it as much as me. All right, I'll see you guys later this week. Bye.